Our scripture reading today is one that has great meaning to all of us and to especially those who serve in uniform. It's from Ecclesiastes 3. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Most of you probably know that my wife broke a hip a couple weeks ago. For those of you who have been so attentive and so helpful, I truly appreciate it. She wanted to come this morning, but in her stead, I have my daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter. So you can keep score and let her know how I do. Pastor Anita, a few weeks ago, announced, as she was talking about this upcoming service that has now become a custom. This is our 7th year that we've done this, and the 7th year that this great choir has been with us. She said several Sundays ago, and I quote, "Preacher Hartzog will be giving the sermon on the 28th. Not hardly. As I've mentioned many times over the last 6 or 7 years, and I had a few comments today, I'm no preacher, but I am a soldier, and so I'll share a few thoughts with you from that perspective here today. First, I stand here in great humility. It's not easy to stand in a pulpit. There are many pressures and many thoughts that go along there. But I stand here today with the sole purpose of honoring those among us, men and women, who have served in uniform, and especially those who died in service of our country. You know, I go in the closet once a year and drag out this uniform. It always surprises me that I can still get into it. I moved the buttons over about an inch years ago. And even though this uniform and the stars and all the ribbons and so forth may seem to some here that I've risen to a high station in life, that could not be further from the truth. I am rounded and grounded by my family and friends, and it is a lesson of humility to me each time I put it on, because I'm representing all of you who have served and all of those who have served. Humility is an interesting concept. Let me share a little story with you about one of my life lessons in humility. My last service in the Army, one of the jobs I had was to drag the Army from history, where we operated with maps and paper, orders and crayons written on acetate and things like that, into the 21st century in things called digits, something I wasn't familiar with then and haven't been since. But in 1998, I was doing this job and putting together the equipment, technologies, concepts, doctrine for this last 10 years of warfare in the Middle East. One of the things that I knew then, it was very apparent that I didn't know what the leaders were going to be like in this century. I knew what they were like in the last century. I'd studied what they had been like since the Revolution, but the people who were going to lead this last 10 years when I was doing this were in the 5th and 6th grade. And so to try to figure that out, I drug out my suit of lights here, got my aides and all the rest of us, and we went to a experimental school in Manassas. I don't even know if it's still there, but it was a paperless school. Kindergarten through the 6th grade, no papers, no chalkboards, no whiteboards, just little machines with big buttons on them that fit the little fingers, and that's how they learned. So I went out there to spend a half day, and I was met as we got out of the car by the principal of the school and two young ladies, which I later learned were sixth graders, and each of them had a big sash. One of them said class president, and the other one said class vice president. And so my leaders for that day were these two young ladies and the lady who happened to be the headmistress of the school. That's been a great morning. I got briefings from computers on the inner workings and hidden mechanisms of an oscilloscope. I dabble around with old cars, so I had heard about what it was, but they taught me a whole lesson on a machine. And I enjoyed that a great deal. So after about 3 or 4 hours of various presentations like this, my aide and the mistress of the school and the two young ladies were leaving. And as we walked out, we passed a group of students. Now these were 4th and 5th graders around the water cooler. And I happened to overhear one of them say, "Hey, do you know who that is?" So I straightened up my uniform and got ready to go over and say hello and shake a hand. And one of the other students said, "Yeah, that's the class president." So I speak today from a greatly developed sense of humility. As I was thinking through what I would say today that had some meaning, it seemed to me like faith, freedom, and the pursuit of peace were tightly knotted together, and never more so than when you've served in one of the uniformed services. Ultimately, peace is about individual peace, about organizational peace, and about peace in the world, something that we're all deeply involved in today. So as it says in the piece of Ecclesiastes that I've just read, there are times in this world in which there is so much turmoil and so much unrest that it's hard to see any solution other than the use of our military. We all hope that there are other alternatives, but that's the way it seems to be. And it's historical. There are many, many periods in the history of our country when that was, in fact, the only solution. Now, we're here today to honor veterans and people who have served. So a few moments about how all of that took place in the history of our country. It started, of course, with a group of ragtag peasants, farmers, few shop makers, and they got together to fight the world's preeminent army, and they did that at our country's birth. 4,435 of our citizens died in that process, or we would not have this country. George Washington, who was their leader, had something to say about all of that, and he said it on his knees in the snow at Valley Forge. He said, "Make sure you know what God wants you to do, and then do it with all of your strength." One of our biggest taxing crises in the history of our country took place in the 1860s, brother against brother, our nation divided. And so Abraham Lincoln was often asked by probably the Union forces if God was on the side of the Union. His response was unique, and it was always the same. He said, "What's really important is that all were on God's side." So World Wars I, II, the Korean conflict, Vietnam, and many, many other places since then, over 350,000 battles that have gone on in our nation's history. So I said individual peace. That's an interesting thought or an interesting concept. Every one of you here has been in some sort of a crisis in their life in which you yearned for peace, and hopefully eventually it came. I looked up some sayings about peace. And there's one, I can't tell you who the author is, a lot of people take credit for it, but it says, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." Now, the most recent place where it got great publicity was in a speech given in 1962 by General Douglas MacArthur to the cadets at West Point. Some of you were probably there. He spoke from the rostrum above the mess hall, and his words were so profound that I considered just bringing that speech and reading it here today. Unfortunately, I have neither his talent nor understanding to do that, but in what he said, I know of no better way to bind together faith, freedom, and the pursuit of peace. Up to this point in our nation's history, what he said has turned out to be very prophetic. There have been many wars, large, small, tough, easy, and most of them were to defend the principles and freedoms of our country. But some recently have been to aid other countries in pursuit of those freedoms. Peace is an elusive concept. So I said we would look at it from three levels. The individual level, I've told you from this pulpit several times before that I have an abiding fear of heights. In fact, I'm not real comfortable looking over the front of this thing. But I am a Army paratrooper, was for over 30 years. And I'll share with you a point of great anxiety, considerable fear, and certainly not peace. When you step out of an airplane that's flying at 120 miles an hour, and you step out 1,000 foot to the ground, you have a great feeling. The feeling is that a big hand has grabbed you and it's throwing you through the air, sort of like one of Max Scherzer's fastballs, I suspect, except you're the ball. So then your parachute opens with a mighty jerk, stomach goes into your mouth, and then all of a sudden, all of that anxiety and all of that fear and all of that bad feeling is gone. And you're alone, peacefully floating around in the heavens, crystal blue sky most of the time. The silence is truly deafening. There is not a sound anywhere. And so my thought about individual peace has something to do with that experience. A few weeks ago, prior to hip break, my wife and I were in Arlington Cemetery to observe the burial of one of my former subordinate commanders. He was the man who led the dash through the berm in the first Gulf War and did it very well. He's about 5'10", he's rather short, fiery little fellow. He led from the front of every activity. His reputation was sealed at his funeral because he had people from every walk of his military life there. People he had commanded in Europe, people that went through the berm with him, etc. It was a rainy day, and I guess tears from heaven is the right thing to say. It was gloomy. All of the people were there, but what happens at a military funeral in Arlington is very special. They had the gray team of horses that day, matched pair, 6. They pull a caisson that's from pre-Civil War. It creaks. And when you get to the burial site, the riderless horse with the reversed boots, the old guard, the ceremonial unit, the absolutely perfect three-round volleys from the firing detail, and a lone bugler off on a hill somewhere not immediately at the gravesite. It struck me in the midst of that as the flag was folded to be presented to his wife, and the notes of taps were echoing across the hills, that my friend and my subordinate, who I thought a great deal of, had found his eternal home and his personal peace. And that's what happens in Arlington. In the business of organizational peace, I think in the military it has something to do with how good the unit is you're serving with. For those of you in the Navy, it was the ship. For those in the Air Force, it was the squadron. And for those in the special operations, it was your brothers in the SEALs and Delta Force. For me and my friend in uniform here, it's the United States Army and the units that you serve in. A good example of what I'm trying to say, not very well, is in another set of television miniseries about a band of brothers. It's a story about Echo Company of the 325th Regiment of the 101st Airborne Division in World War II. It starts with their training. They didn't have a very good leader at the beginning, and they fumbled around for a while. Then they went to war. They found each other. They found a sense of peace and belonging to a unit that was very good. Had the opportunity once to speak to the commander of that outfit, He was a farmer in Pennsylvania, long retired by that time, now deceased. But he said, I said, what was it that made your unit so good? He said, well, we trusted each other. We knew each other. We cared about each other. And it was a very peaceful thing. At the national level, we often divide our situation into war or peace. As you've seen in the last 10 to 15 years, there is nothing that is either today precisely war or precisely peace. It's always a combination of the things. I looked it up in the Op Center business, and that at this particular point, we have over 250 countries in which U.S. military folks are fighting, 4 seas, battle groups all over the world, ships and planes that are watching through the night so that we deter and don't have to fight. Finally, for every soldier, sailor, airman, Marines, Coast Guardsman, whoever serves on a battlefield, be it ground, air, or sea, there is always a difficult moment of personal testing. How can the warrior serve both God and Caesar at the same time? It's an old question. Every one of us who's done that has asked it at some level, usually quietly in the middle of the night. How can the warrior follow the commander of his or her superiors and the 10 Commandments at the same time? If you haven't ever thought about it, read it carefully. Every individual must come to grips with this conundrum in their own way. For me, it has to do with a simple set of words. And now, over a half century ago, I raised my hand, said them, and said them again and again as I served in different places and different grades in the Army. They read like this: I, state your name, having been appointed an officer in the Army of the United States, same thing for the Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and then I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I'm about to enter. And then the answer to all of the conundrum in the last 4 words: so help me God.